Hello there. My research specialism is in drug policy, and more specifically, I'm interested in how we can reconfigure drug policy through the prism of human rights. And here, I'm going to make the case for the decriminalisation of psychedelics on the basis that the prohibitive drug laws are philosophically untenable, empirically unsubstantiated, and consequently that such prohibition breaches our human rights, such as the right to freedom of thought, also known as cognitive liberty. And there have been some important gains globally in the realm of drug policy in recent years, and I want to track this progress, particularly in relation to victories rooted in human rights arguments, as well as discussing the significant challenges that remain, especially in the United Kingdom. And I'll also be engaging with a recent critique of this approach, the charge of psychedelic exceptionalism, with a view to hopefully persuading you that rather a demand for our cognitive liberty rights to be respected can lead to social justice, to the collapsing of prohibition for all. So first of all, what's meant by the concept of cognitive liberty? And cognitive liberty is in one sense synonymous with freedom of thought, yet more precisely evokes the idea that this should be read to acknowledge the fact that individuals should have the right to autonomous self-determination over their own brain chemistry. Given the chemical nature of human thought processes, controlling the substances that can lawfully be ingested, prohibiting psychedelics, can be seen as an unjustifiable interference with cognitive liberty, with these molecules being the necessary precursors to particular styles of thinking. And this isn't, as it's sometimes misleadingly and somewhat reductively framed, about our right to drugs, the importance of which people may agree or disagree on, but rather the seminal issue of our freedom and the extent to which it's acceptable for the state to impinge upon it. And this is the central concern of classic liberalism, perhaps most famously espoused by legal theorist John Stuart Mill. And Mill was concerned with the nature and limits of the power that can legitimately be exercised by the state over the individual. And crucially, Mill laid down the principle of the prevention of harm to others as essential to justifiable criminalisation from a liberal perspective. Liberalism rules out paternalism in no uncertain terms, so the idea that the state should legislate to protect people from themselves. And yet the drug laws are explicitly premised in it, with our primary piece of drug legislation, the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, referring to a drug's potential to harm oneself as legitimate grounds for criminalisation. With its implicit infantilisation, paternalism is deeply problematic. It should remain up to us as individuals, not the state spuriously on our behalf, to prioritise whether or not we accord greater value to the psychedelic experience versus an outside risk of either physical or psychological harm. Further, even on paternalistic grounds, the psychedelic drug laws fail. How can being subjected to state punishment possibly be for an individual's own good when the primary and often solitary harm being suffered is that inflicted from on high rather than from having been high? And liberalism also rules out legal moralism, that notorious conclusion in search of an argument. Moralism is, of course, a slippery concept, vague enough that it can distort unrecognisably, depending upon which reality tunnel it's viewed through. However, in the realm of drug policy, it's normally used to describe a small c conservative position, namely the ideology that drug users should be subject to punitive measures as there's something intrinsically wrong with drug taking. Liberty comprises freedom to choose, including the freedom to make what the moral majority might consider to be bad choices. And really, how could it be otherwise? Who but we can decide what's of value to us? It's through such choices, including those regarding which substances to ingest or not, that we engage in self-creation. And when the law limits such choices, it curtails who we can become. And this is unacceptable in a supposedly liberal democracy designed to embrace pluralism. Mill famously advocated experiments in living, and in accordance with this view, individuals should be free to carry out chemical experiments in the organic laboratories of their own bodies. So in line with Mill, I argue for a negative right to liberty, the freedom to be left alone to do as one pleases, so long as society is not thereby harmed, which is, I believe, a more authentically moral position. And crucially, the liberal spirit is enshrined within the European Convention on Human Rights, potentially according these arguments legal clout. One of the fundamental roles of human rights protections is to patrol the boundaries between the state and the individual, guarding against unreasonable, arbitrary interference with the latter by the former. And the European Convention is embedded in our domestic law, and the courts are meant to read all legislation so as to be compatible with it, or, where this isn't seen to be possible, to make a declaration of incompatibility to which the legislator must respond. And of particular relevance here, Article 9 protects freedom of thought, meaning that incursions into this right will only be valid as a necessary and proportionate response to circumstances where exercising that right would create real, measurable harms in society. So our cognitive liberty is protected, on paper at least. But what's more questionable is the ease with which this right is transgressed in practice, most notably by our drug laws, without recourse to scientific proof. The Misuse of Drugs Act, for instance, whilst ostensibly rooted in harm, clearly isn't. The best available science reveals, rather, that it's composed of pseudo-scientific divisions not borne out by empirical evidence, with an almost perversely inverse correlation between risk of harm and positioning within it. And this is most striking in relation to the psychedelics. Whilst they pose a very low risk of harm, the vast majority of them are criminalised as Class A drugs. And that the state provides substantial, rather than merely rhetorical protection of human rights is of great importance for minority groups, those that require shielding from the tendency of democracies without such safeguards to veer towards mob rule. And where human rights are being restricted, the burden of proof as regards showing harm to others should be on the state to avoid these protections being hollowed out. Human rights start to eat themselves where the law only truly respects them when they append to individuals deemed to be exercising their autonomy in an acceptable way. And whilst, of course, it would be disingenuous to deny the potential for any harm consequent to psychedelic use, such risk needs to be contextualised. Many people live lives we might consider physically, emotionally, and indeed spiritually unhealthy. But that, however, is their business, even accepting that there are undeniably consequences for broader society. The state, in its various guises, as funded by the taxpayer, is often called upon to mop up the mess resulting from unwise choices. However, that doesn't mean that such choices oughtn't still to be respected, or at the very least tolerated. There are necessary limits on what the state should be trying to achieve, certainly through the blunt tool of the criminal law. Furthermore, any potential harms from psychedelics need to be balanced against their potential benefits. The fact that these substances may advantage their users remains largely absent from the drug policy debate. For instance, the idea that people should be free to take psychedelics because they enjoy them is rarely invoked, as though pleasure were a dirty word and there must be some higher motivation to get high. And this needs to be challenged to avoid implicit complicity with the underlying moral puritanism of mainstream discourse. And that's not to say that there aren't often higher motivations for getting high. As you know, along with their hedonic properties, many users of psychedelics profess great benefits from them, up to and including enlightenment, or at least transient glimpses of it, which is perhaps the best we can hope for. So, whilst cognitive liberty arguments are often derided as trivial, a counter-argument is that what we're fighting for is the legal right to use substances that provide the most reliable route to the profoundest of human experiences, to what some experience as the ultimate nature of reality, the recognition of who we truly are. In the context of the long story of human evolution, prohibition is a relatively recent phenomenon. We've been doing drugs a lot longer than we've been doing prohibition, with strong evidence of humanity having taken psychoactive substances in almost all cultures throughout deep history, traditionally in their plant forms. Indeed, the states of consciousness these plants can open us up to are the substrate of many of our mystical and religious traditions. And of course, psychedelics can be instruments of healing. Indeed, they're fast gaining legitimacy in the medical realm, in the field of psychotherapy, where they're showing great promise in treating a range of mental health conditions, from PTSD to depression to addiction to end-of-life anxiety, none of which, incidentally, is news to the underground healers who've continued using them with their clients over the years. And this renaissance of overground psychedelic psychotherapy is wonderful, but we mustn't stop there. There's good evidence that psychedelics can be of benefit to healthy people, and these substances can be pivotal to enhancing our potential to exist in the world in a meaningful way, helping us to connect. The converse of connection, disconnection, can be seen to be at the root of much human suffering, along with the destructive acting out that can ensue in its wake. And there's some very interesting work on this coming from across many different disciplines, looking at how the mystical experience that psychedelics can engender, that experience of oneness, which is the ultimate reconnection, not only helps the neurotic chatter of the ego-bound self to pipe down at least a little, but can also lead to a deeper appreciation of our entanglement with and concern for those around us, for our broader environment. Acknowledgement of this fact, that the benefits users might accrue from their psychedelic use often consequently advantage society as a whole, is legally significant, puncturing the notion that a choice of necessity has to be made between either respecting the freedom of individuals to use psychedelics or protecting society from such psychedelic use. As is rendered apparent by the psychedelic experience, dichotomies between self and other are illusory, and we need autonomous, self-realized individuals to help society to progress. However, hopes for progressive, human rights-informed psychedelic drug policy reform seem perhaps ever further away, at least in the UK, given that in 2016, the Psychoactive Substances Act was passed, a piece of legislation that creates a blanket ban on trade in any substance capable of producing a psychoactive effect. And the stated aim of the Psychoactive Substances Act is to make provision about psychoactive substances. And this seemingly innocuous statement insidiously uncouples drug legislation from the concept of harm, which has traditionally, at least ostensibly, underpinned this area, as embodied within the proclaimed intentions of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, namely to make provision with respect to dangerous or otherwise harmful drugs. Now, of course, I've already alluded to some of the well-documented problems with how the earlier legislation is deployed in practice, such as the questionable classification of the psychedelics. However, the fact that the Psychoactive Substances Act removes even the charade of drug policy being about reducing harm is alarming. Indeed, this divorcing of drug prohibition from harm is its whole raison d'etre, drafted as it was to avoid the cumbersome process of having to at least go through the motions of demonstrating that a substance is harmful before its inclusion in the prohibitive system, as required by the Misuse of Drugs Act. The Psychoactive Substances Act is thus fundamentally illiberal, legal moralism writ large. Section 2 of the Psychoactive Substances Act defines a psychoactive substance as any substance which affects the person's mental functioning or emotional state. And as such, the Act can be seen as an unmasked threat to cognitive liberty, unfortunately vindicating those of us who've long argued that drug policy is as much concerned with controlling mind states as preventing harm. To reiterate, the role of the criminal law should be to prevent harm to society from making the conscious decision to explore their own consciousness. And while the motivation behind this piece of legislation was the perceived need to address the growing phenomenon of novel psychoactive substances, the absence of the word novel in the Act means that it also criminalises the ancient plant medicines, ironically conflated with drugs of abuse, addiction to which they can help to break. Addiction can be conceptualized as a repeated, fruitless attempt to fill the spiritual void, a sense of lack that the plant medicines can actually address. Relatedly, and tying back to points made earlier, given that many who use plant medicines experience them as enabling direct experience of the divine, the fact that they've now been prohibited is a clear breach of not only the right to freedom of thought, to cognitive liberty, but also to religious freedom. Indeed, this development emphasises yet further the importance of approaching drug policy from the perspective of human rights, ensuring a healthy relationship between the state and the individual. As evidenced, when that's lost, the state believes it has the right to tell people that they can't ingest anything that has a psychoactive effect unless they've been given explicit permission to do so. Ironically, exemptions from the legislation include those potentially extremely harmful yet culturally sanctioned psychoactive substances, alcohol and tobacco, rendering the Act internally incoherent. Given the earlier failure to include alcohol and tobacco in the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, their explicit exemption from the Psychoactive Substances Act merely foregrounds a problem of silent hypocrisy that has long been the backdrop to drug policy, undermining respect for the law for generations. The fact that drinkers of alcohol can alter their consciousness freely, their Article 9 rights to cognitive liberty undisturbed by state sanction, despite the risk of harm they pose to others, while psychedelic users are persecuted, exposes the shakiness of the moral high ground on which prohibitionists ostensibly stand. Drug policy ought not to be based on the drug preferences of those with power, but rather rooted in human rights and the best available scientific evidence. And perhaps it's time for a test case to be brought in the courts, challenging the Psychoactive Substances Act as incompatible with our human rights obligations. And a case involving one of the plant medicines seems most promising. Although the few human rights challenges to drug prohibition that been brought in the UK in the past have been unsuccessful, this is no reason to give up hope. For one thing, no such challenge has yet been brought in relation to the Psychoactive Substances Act, and given the absence of harm underpinning its blanket prohibition, alongside the fact that it criminalises plants with long histories of spiritual use, a strong case could be made. That's not to say that it would be successful. Judicial decisions in this realm are undeniably politicised, but it's worth a shot. And indeed, in support of the fact that this is more than just a pipe dream, there have been a few instances in recent years of successful challenges to prohibitive drug laws on the grounds that they breach human rights in other nations. And I want to look briefly at one of these, the South African Supreme Court case of Prince, decided in 2018. And Prince was successful in arguing that the prohibition of cannabis for personal use was an unjustifiable breach of the right to privacy, as enshrined within the South African Constitution. As you know, liberalism is predominantly concerned with the question of the appropriate boundaries of the relationship between the individual and the state. And here, the court came down firmly in the camp of those of us who believe that the prohibition of personal usage of cannabis inappropriately crosses that line, amounting to an unconstitutional breach of autonomy. And importantly, alongside their deontological analysis of whether or not Prince's right to privacy had been unduly breached, involving much scrutiny of the relevant theoretical literature, the court made it clear that any interference with his right would have to be justified by the state with reference to harm, and that harm would have to be proven with recourse to evidence. In this vein, the court itself engaged in consequentialist reasoning, scrutinising all the best scientific material available on both the harms and benefits of cannabis, leading them to reject the legislative view of the necessity of the prohibition of personal consumption of the plant as outweighing Prince's right to decide for himself how to live. In other words, the court here refreshingly applied the relevant judicial human rights tests as they're meant to be applied, rather than simply deferring to the legislator, as is unfortunately so often the case. And it's not only the fact that Prince won that's notable here, that he won on human rights grounds, specifically his right to autonomy, and that the decision was rooted in empirical evidence rather than unsubstantiated opinion. Also remarkable is the discursive style of the judgment in his favour, which is a tour de force that reads like it was written by the most ardent drug policy reform activist, taking side swipes at the hypocrisy of legal moralists, at the racist ideology embedded in prohibition. As an aside, I don't think it's particularly significant that this claim was brought on the grounds of privacy, of self-creation, rather than freedom of thought, of cognitive liberty. The difference is really one of framing, as in actuality, the autonomy rights are all interwoven. There's a clear overlap, for instance, between what we have the freedom to think and who we have the privacy to become. And perhaps privacy is a more generally palatable right than cognitive liberty, although the latter has clear appeal in the psychedelic community. And of course, challenging prohibition using a human rights-based approach through the courts is only one way of bringing about change. The concept of cognitive liberty is also useful as a consciousness-raising tool, helping to inspire grassroots movements to push for change. And in reality, the two approaches are entwined. It's often activist groups who bring test cases. And further, although a successful test case is technically only reliant on providing an unjustifiable breach of the rights of a single individual, pragmatically, any fight for psychedelic users' rights in the courts is much more likely to succeed where undergirded by somewhat of a shift in broader public attitudes. And in this spirit, we've seen the rise of psychedelic societies around the globe in recent years, whose mission, amongst other things, is to destigmatize psychedelic use, to unleash psychedelic pride, complete with organizing psychedelic coming out events. And of course, coming out as a psychedelic user is not an easy thing to do, given how high the stakes can be when admitting to a criminalized activity, such as loss of employment, loss of freedom to travel to certain countries, and so on. But it was also far from easy for those who came out in the more traditional sense of the term when being gay was outlawed. Yet over a relatively short space of time, this has morphed from being illegal to same-sex couples' right to marry being increasingly recognised in many nations. And this is further evidence that things can change, things do change, and that they can change through a rights-based activism. Indeed, we're already starting to see such change in the form of psychedelic decriminalisation in some states in the US. So, for instance, in 2019, Denver, Colorado effectively decriminalised psilocybin. What they actually did was to make possession and growing of psilocybin mushrooms the city police's lowest law enforcement priority. And no doubt it wasn't a particularly high priority anyhow, so this reform is in some sense largely symbolic. But symbols matter. They can signal a paradigm shift, which indeed this one did. Since then, for instance, Oakland has effectively decriminalised all entheogenic plants. Oregon has approved psilocybin therapy and decriminalised possession of all drugs, and many other cities are following suit, decriminalising certain psychedelics. What we're starting to see is the cessation of the application of unjust laws, at least when it comes to possession of these particular substances. Liberty, cognitive and indeed physical, is no longer being circumscribed. Which brings me on to addressing one of the charges that's been levelled at those of us arguing for the decriminalisation of psychedelics in recent years, that of psychedelic exceptionalism. And this is the criticism that in advocating for the decriminalisation of psychedelics, or perhaps of certain psychedelics, maybe exclusively the plant medicines, for instance, we're guilty of throwing users of other substances under the bus, of undermining the broader project of wholesale drug policy reform. And this perceived problem of psychedelic exceptionalism is seen to be exacerbated by the fact that who uses the so-called good drugs and who uses the so-called bad drugs broadly reflects and thereby helps to perpetuate socioeconomic divisions, inadvertently shoring up the prohibitive narrative as a rational response to those on the wrong side of the divide. Now, in response to this, for me, as I've laid out, the guiding principles in drug policy for all psychoactive substances are a concern with liberal tenets, with weighing scientifically proven harms against benefits in making the decision as regards whether our human rights, our freedom, can justifiably be interfered with. And from this perspective, it's arguable, indeed I have just been arguing, that the psychedelics are exceptional given their low risk of harm and the abundance of benefits they can engender. However, when measuring harm, we need to concern ourselves not just with the harm potential of the substance itself, prohibition can bring. And with that in mind, even in relation to drugs with a higher risk profile, with less associated benefits, ending criminalisation is likely the rational response, especially when one factors in human rights issues. The cognitive liberty argument is not premised on our right to modulate our consciousness in a particular psychedelic way, but rather in the belief that the curation of our mental experience should be a decision for us alone. You might think it's a terrible decision to peer into the abyss that spice opens up, for instance, but it must make a certain kind of sense to the predominantly highly marginalised people who choose to do so. It must offer some kind of succour, or they wouldn't do it. And when we add into the mix the unequal way in which the drug laws are wielded, broader drug decriminalisation becomes a social justice issue. On which point it's always important to remember that far from being incidental, this discriminatory deployment of the drug laws was central to their creation, with the deeper history of prohibition steeped in the desire to control groups seen as problematic: immigrants, the hippies, the Black Panthers, and on and on. The only caveat I will add here is that there's perhaps a stronger case for prohibition to be replaced with a stricter system of regulation when it comes to substances, the use of which potentially risks more harm to society. So, whilst I do think psychedelics are exceptional, ultimately I'm not a psychedelic exceptionalist. Indeed, if you think the psychedelic vision is one of exceptionalism, you've rather missed the point. However, I'm also a pragmatist, and as we're witnessing, the edifice of prohibition will be eroded little by little. So it makes a certain kind of sense to pick your battles, whilst always being alive to the importance of how you frame the argument. I think a call for the decriminalisation of psychedelics, framed around cognitive liberty, around human rights, passes this test. As followed to its logical conclusion, it's a challenge to the prohibitive model in its entirety, to the very idea that the state should be in control of our consciousness, of any of our consciousnesses. Thank you.